really going to give you some reasons that you can't quit. Okay? Are you still with me? Mm-hmm. Nobody's fallen asleep from the carbs yet? Okay. I'm not going to tell you there haven't been times when I wanted to quit. It is extremely exhausting to love somebody who brings one crisis after another, after another, after another into your life. You reach the point where you're afraid to answer the phone. If you see a police car just kind of randomly go by your house, you just know they are headed to your house, and they probably are. I've been there too. If you are like me, or if you know someone like me, they have done the rounds of the treatment centers. They have changed the face of their retirement, taking care of grandchildren that their children are not taken care of. I've got a friend in Florida, and she and her husband is 74. He's 74, and she is my age. She's much younger than that because she's my age. They had to adopt their grandkids to keep them from going into the system because the mom had lost parental rights. And that man is going to work until he dies because those kids are still young. And as my friend Carolyn stood before a judge, the judge looked at her and said, "I have one question for you, Mrs. McKay." And she said, "Yes, Your Honor, what is it?" And he said, "Who's going to raise the next generation?" And I'm telling you, this is a serious problem. People are hurting. As much, I really do love the prodigals. And you know what? They love me. But buddy, it was a journey to get to where I could even stand to be in the same room with prodigals because of my own stuff and the things that I had seen. But my heart is for the families who are suffering, and particularly the veterans' families. I was telling somebody this before, with Brandon, before the meeting really got started. I really got a heart for the veterans who come home broken in body, broken in spirit, and they come home to broken families. And the environment is just perfect to have somebody in that family begin to act out. And then our veterans come home really limping along. And they have to deal with things that those of us who have never had to face what they have to face don't know how we're going to deal with. How in the world are they going to deal with it? And these are some of the reasons you can't quit. You can't quit because you can hope in God. Psalm 42:5 says, "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope thou in God." The bottom line is that I'm looking for my notes here. Okay. When all else has failed, you can hope in God. And let me tell you, the battle that is going on is not between you and your prodigal. The battle is going on between your prodigal and your God, his God. And of course, God doesn't have any grandchildren, but the real battle is this way, not this way. Another reason that you can't quit is because God hasn't quit on you. Hebrews 12:2 says to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. You know, that verse so spoke to me because if you love a prodigal, you're on a first-name basis with shame. Not only do you know all the stunts that your prodigal has pulled, but so does everybody else. If your prodigal has broken the law, it's probably been in the newspaper. And man, it hurts. It hurts to see families falling apart. It hurts to see your family falling apart. But God has not quit on you. You know, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said, "God, if it be your will that this cup pass from me, then let it pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." We need to finish. We need to finish the course. Another reason you can't quit is because the people you love are watching you. Wally Beebe was a friend of mine. He led me to Christ, and he and his wife were my first Christian friends. And they loved me. He loved me until the day he died, and she still loves me. Go figure. She does, though. And when my kids were acting out and I was so discouraged, he used to say, "You've got to be a rock." And I'd say, "I'm not a rock." And he'd say, "You've got to be a rock." And I'd say, "But I'm not a rock." And he'd say, "You absolutely cannot quit. You can't quit. You have to be the last apple clinging to that tree. Because if your kids don't learn from you how not to quit, who are they going to learn it from?" And that's what I would say to you. I looked at the spirit that Alan showed up here after the last year's been a tough year, hasn't it? But that isn't what he shows when he talks. He shows he's on the victory side. He shows he's on the overcomer side. And that's a minute-by-minute thing, isn't it, Alan? I know it has to be. But you know what? The people that you love are watching you. And the scripture tells us that we're to teach our children, and it doesn't say teach them when you have devotions in the morning before they go to school. That's great if you do that. I'm glad if you do that. That's not what it says. It says you teach your children when you stand up and when you sit down and when you go in and when you come out and when you rise up and when you go to bed, you teach your children. And what it's saying is that we're teaching our children with our lives. I hope that I'm around long enough to see the kind of courage, the kind of stamina, the kind of stubborn determination that those two girls have when they're grown. Because I know where they will have learned it. Another reason you can't...
That's scary.
Another reason you can't quit is because God has not given you permission to quit. Okay? God is sovereign, and that isn't something that we usually hear about God. You might hear God's mean, and he'll beat you up, and he'll get you if you don't do what's right. Or you might hear that God is good, which he is. He also is sovereign, and he has not given you permission to quit. He hasn't. I've got a friend, some of you may know Ronnie and Sandra Cheapwood, because they lived here for several years and pastored a church. Their oldest son was killed in a car accident. He was killed by a drunk driver. And if any kid should have been okay, this one should. He was a college student, surrendered to missions. He was going to be a missionary doctor. And one night, he was killed by a drunk driver. Sandra told me later on, Sandra and Ronnie and Sandra have been friends of ours for 8 years or so. And Sandra told me that the one thing she learned more than anything else from all of that is that God was sovereign. He isn't some Santa Claus with a white beard who's there to get you out of a jam when you're in a jam. He is the sovereign God of the universe, and he doesn't have to ask your permission to do things. I often check my email. Sometimes I check it several times a day to see if I have an email from God asking my opinion about things. And so far, that has not happened. Now, don't misunderstand me. I have an opinion on most things, but God is not terribly interested in what my opinion is. And guess what? He's not really interested in what your opinion is either. Nobody in the Bible had more problems than Job did. If any person ever had a right to say to God, "What in the world are you thinking of?" it would be Job. And in fact, Job did finally say, "I would that there were a judge to judge between me and God, because he would find on my side." Really, Job? You know, God had not spoken and gotten in this big discussion in the book of Job, until Job said that. And then he had an answer for Job. He said, "Gird up your loins now like a man, because I'm going to ask of you, and you're going to answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" So I would just kind of gently remind you that you might not be Shirley MacLaine standing down on the beach screaming, "I am God, I am God." Not very effective for her. And telling God what he needs to do about your kid, your spouse, your sister, your brother, your parent, that's not very effective either. I know, because I have tried it. Another reason you can't quit is because there's a battle to be won. Don't make the mistake of thinking that this is not a battle. It is a spiritual battle, and you are on the front lines if you love a prodigal. In Daniel 6, it tells the story about how the king had written a law. He'd been tricked into writing a law that said if any man asked something of any god or any person except the king, he was going to be thrown in the lion's den. It says Daniel knew that writing, and he said when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house and he prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Now, I like to think that I'm single-minded. I like to think that I'm tenacious. I like to think that I am determined. But Harry and my kids would say I am dog-down stubborn. My head is just like this. If I set my mind to something, you are not going to budge me. Don't you think that it's time that we get our spiritual backs up about the heyday that Satan is having in the lives of the people that we love? Don't you think it's time that we kind of get our backs up about that and plant both feet and refuse to quit just because we're too doggone stubborn to quit? There was a time when I actually said to Harry, tell me how to quit. I don't know how to quit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I am every once in a while going to have a brat attack, and I'm going to take my sippy cup and I'm going to bang it on my high chair. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it on the side of believing God and not giving up, rather than on the side of being a quitter. The last reason that you can't quit is because the story isn't finished yet. Song of Solomon says, "Who is this that cometh up out of the wilderness, leaning on the arm of her beloved?" You know, we are, if you know the Lord, you are the bride of Christ. And this wilderness that you are in is not going to last forever. It's not going to last forever. Truly, it's not. And the time is going to come, if we just abide faithful, when we can come up out of the wilderness, leaning on the arm of our beloved, who has been with us in the wilderness all the time. I got just a couple